Tonight, we step into the rough, the unsure, and the not-so-great side of the Middle Ages. You might think of big meals and flags. Most days were just about making it through the night. The truth is, you probably wouldn't survive a single day. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. It's always interesting to see who's watching from around the world. Put your phone down, keep the sound low. Let's begin. The story starts, as so many huge and scary things do, in a place of deep silence. It starts on the great dry sea of grass that is the Central Asian steppe. Imagine a silence so total it feels heavy, a land of endless rolling earth under a huge and uncaring sky. For hundreds of years, this was the home of a secret, a tiny deal between a germ, a flea, and a rodent. The germ, an old and very deadly organism we would one day call Yersinia pestis, was not in its own world a monster. It was simply a fact of life, a part of a stable, cruel, and totally natural cycle. Its main home was inside the blood of the countless burrowing rodents that made up the true population of the steppe. The marmots, the gerbils, the great-toothed sussex. These creatures lived in huge underground cities, their numbers growing and shrinking with the seasons, and within their communities, the sickness was always there. It was a constant low hum of death. The way this cycle worked was one of beautiful, deadly simplicity. A flea called Xenosiliciopis would bite an infected rodent, drawing a meal of blood full of bacteria. Inside the flea's stomach, the bacteria would multiply with amazing speed, forming a thick, jelly-like blockage in its front gut. The flea, now always starving, would become frantic. It would bite with a desperate, unstoppable aggression. But because of the blockage, it could not swallow. Instead, with each try to feed, it would throw up a mix of plague bacteria directly into the blood of its new host. And so the cycle turned. A marmot would get sick, its lymph nodes swelling into painful buboes, its body giving in to fever and blood infection. It would go back to its burrow to die. As its body cooled, its fleas, now hungry and carrying a full load of Yersinia pestis, would leave, looking for the warmth of the nearest living creature. Usually, this was another marmot in the same colony. The plague would burn slowly within these huge rodent populations, a fire beneath the earth, mostly invisible and almost totally unimportant to the business of humans. For a very long time, the steppe kept its secret well, but the world is never truly still. In the early 1300s, two huge, unrelated forces began to come together on this fragile balance. The first was weather. The planet was getting cooler. The long, stable warmth of what historians call the medieval warm period was giving way to the uneven and harsh cold of the Little Ice Age on the steppes. This turned into chaos. Long periods of no rain would dry out the grasslands, destroying the rodent populations and squeezing them around the few remaining water sources. This forced different species, normally separate, into close, unnatural contact. Then sudden rains would come, flooding the burrows and pushing the survivors out onto the open plains in huge movements. In both cases, the result was the same. The plague cycle was violently broken. Starving fleas, their usual hosts dead or moved, were forced to become less picky. They would jump upon anything warm-blooded that passed by. A camel, a goat, a horse, or the fur-covered hunter who tried to profit from the unusually plentiful marmot pelts. The tiny barrier between the animal and human worlds, once a strong wall, was becoming dangerously weak. The second great force was human. This was the age of the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. Genghis Khan's descendants now ruled the largest connected land empire in human history, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the borders of Poland. Their conquest had been brutal, but the result was an unusual era of stability and communication across Asia. The old Silk Road, once a dangerous network of disconnected paths, was now a secure and well-protected superhighway. The Mongols, masters of organization, had set up a system of relay stations known as yam, stocked with fresh horses and supplies, allowing messengers and merchants to travel with amazing speed. A caravan could now cross the continent in a matter of months, not years. This new globalized world was a miracle of trade and cultural exchange. It carried silk from China, spices from the Indies, and ideas from Persia. But it also carried stowaways. The same caravans that transported precious goods also transported grain. And where there was grain, there were rats, specifically the black rat, Rattus rattus, a creature perfectly suited to human society, a skilled climber, and a sneaky passenger. And clinging to the fur of these rats were the fleas. A single flea born on a dying marmot near the shores of Lake Issyk-Kul in modern-day Kyrgyzstan could now begin an epic journey, hitching a ride in a sack of wheat, travelling from rat to rat, from caravan to caravan, moving steadily westward toward a continent that had no memory of its silent bacterial passenger and no immunity whatsoever. The steppe secret was out. It was travelling at the speed of trade, a slow-motion disaster unrolling along the world's most advanced trade network. By the 1330s, it had reached China. By the 1340s, it was moving through the great trading centres of Samarkand and Tabriz. And by 1346, it had arrived at the gates of Europe, ready to make its formal introduction. That introduction would take place at a city called Kaffa, a glittering prize on the Crimean Peninsula. Today we call it Feudalism. In the mid-1300s, it was one of the most important strategic places of the Republic of Genoa. The Genoese, alongside their great rivals, the Venetians, were the masters of Mediterranean trade. They were the middlemen, the organizational geniuses who connected Europe to the vast wealth of the East. Kaffa was their gateway. It was a fortified port on the Black Sea, a busy cosmopolitan city where Italian merchants bargained with Armenian traders, Greek sailors, and Tatar nomads. Ships, loaded with silks, spices, and grain, would leave its harbour, bound for Constantinople, and from there to every corner of Europe. It was a vital point in the network of global trade, a funnel through which the riches of the Orient flowed west. But a funnel, of course, works in both directions. In 1345, the city's successful routine was broken. Janibeg, the powerful Khan of the Golden Horde, the Mongol authority in the region, laid siege to Kaffa. The dispute was a familiar one, a dangerous mix of trade disagreements and religious tensions. Janibeg's Mongol army, a huge and disciplined force of cavalry and engineers, surrounded the city's strong stone walls. For the Genoese defenders, it was a terrifying but not an unusual situation. They were well supplied, their walls were strong, and their control of the sea meant that in theory they could hold out forever. The siege dragged on through 1346, a brutal and grinding fight of attacks, small battles and bombardments. The Mongols brought their huge siege engines, their trebuchets to bear, hurling enormous stones against the city's walls. The Genoese defenders repaired the damage, returned fire with their own catapults, and waited. It was a standoff, a contest of supplies and willpower. And then something changed. A new and terrible enemy appeared, one that respected neither Mongol discipline nor Genoese walls. The plague, having travelled faithfully along the trade routes with the Mongol armies, arrived in their camp. It spread through the closely packed tents with terrifying speed. Soldiers who were healthy at morning roll call were feverish by noon and dead by nightfall. The Mongol war machine, one of the most effective military forces on the planet, began to fall apart from the inside out. The proud cavalrymen of the steppe, who feared no human enemy, were helpless against this invisible foe. The siege weakened. The daily bombardments became occasional, then stopped altogether. The besieging army was itself under siege. From within the walls of Kaffa, the Genoese watched this development with a mixture of relief and fear. They could see the smoke from the funeral fires. They could hear the sounds of an army in its death throes. Janibeg, watching his power disappear, was consumed by a frustrated rage. He could not take the city, but he could make its defenders share in his army's agony. And so, he gave a new, horrible order to the crews of his trebuchets. The stone-throwing stopped. Instead, the soldiers began to load the machines with the swollen, blackened corpses of their own plague-dead comrades. This was not a smart strategy of biological warfare in the modern sense. It was an act of pure spiteful terror. One chronicler, an Italian notary named Gabriele de Mussi, who heard the accounts from fleeing survivors, described the scene. He wrote of the great soaring arcs of the dead as they were flung over the walls, so that the bodies of the dead were flung into the city. The Christians could not hide or flee or escape from them, although they dumped as many of the bodies as they could in the sea, and soon the rotting bodies tainted the air and poisoned the water supply. The physical effect of this bombardment was likely limited. The real damage was psychological and, more importantly, biological in a way the Mongols couldn't have fully understood. It wasn't the tainted air or the poisoned water that posed the greatest threat. The true weapons were not the corpses themselves, but the microscopic passengers they carried, and the slightly larger passengers carried on their clothing and bodies. With every decaying body that landed within the city walls came a new wave of infected rats, and more critically, a new population of hungry host-seeking fleas. The Genoese had barred their gates to the Mongol army, but they could not bar them to an enemy the size of a pinhead. The plague was now inside the city. Panic erupted. The defenders, who had bravely faced down a Mongol horde, had no weapon against this. Their only thought was to escape. The siege was effectively over. The Genoese abandoned Kaffa, scrambling aboard their galleys in the harbour, desperate to flee the dying city and return to the safety of home. They did not know, could not have known, that they had become the delivery system. They were no longer merchants. They were messengers of death, and their cargo, far more powerful than any silk or spice, was now sealed within the wooden hulls of their ships, ready for its European tour. The journey from Kaffa to Sicily was a voyage through a floating nightmare. Imagine the scene aboard one of these Genoese galleys, a long, narrow ship powered by oars and a single sail. It would have been dangerously overcrowded, packed with sailors, merchants, and a few desperate refugees from the city, all crammed together with the cargo. And of course the rats. They were everywhere, in the grain stores, in the rigging, in the bilges, a constant scurrying presence. In the first few days at sea, everything might have seemed normal. The mood would have been one of grim relief. They had escaped, but then the first sailor would have fallen ill. A sudden fever, chills, and exhaustion. He would have been accused of faking, perhaps, till the other signs appeared. The telltale swellings in the groin or the armpit, the buboes, or as the Italians would come to call them, the gavoccioli, dark, tender, and growing to the size of an egg or an apple. Soon after, black or purple blotches would appear on his skin, the result of bleeding under the skin. He would become delirious, perhaps coughing up blood, and then within a few days, he would be dead. Soon, another sailor would sicken, then another. The disease moved through the confined space of the ship with breathtaking efficiency. The healthy were forced to live and work alongside the dying. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The rhythmic chanting of the oarsmen would have been replaced by the groans of the sick. The deck would have become a slaughterhouse. Men died at their oars, in their bunks. Their bodies left where they fell. The survivors, a dwindling number of terrified, skeletal figures, would have struggled to man the ship, their minds clouded by fear and the dawning, horrific realization that they had not escaped the sickness at all. They had merely sealed themselves inside a box with it. Of the many ships that fled Kaffa, some surely vanished without a trace, their entire crews consumed by the plague, becoming ghost ships, drifting aimlessly on the Mediterranean until they ran aground or were broken apart by a storm. But some, through a combination of luck and sheer desperate will, continued on. A dozen of these galleys, ghostly and half-manned, navigated through the Aegean, past a still uninfected Greece, and across the Ionian Sea. Their prows pointed toward Italy. Their destination was the port of Messina in Sicily. In October of 1347, the people of Messina looked out from their harbour and saw the Genoese ships approaching. It was a familiar and welcome sight. The arrival of a trade convoy meant goods, news, and money. The city was a busy, successful port, a critical stopping point for traffic moving up the Italian peninsula. The townspeople would have gathered at the docks, ready to greet the sailors, to unload the cargo, to hear tales from the exotic East. But as the 12 galleys drew closer, it became clear that something was terribly wrong. There was no sound of activity from the decks, no sailors lining the rails, ready to cast their mooring lines. The ships moved with an eerie, sluggish silence. They drifted into the harbour like phantoms. When the harbourmaster and his officials rowed out and boarded the lead ship, they were met with a scene from a nightmarish vision of hell. The stench was overwhelming, a foul mixture of sickness and decay. The decks were littered with the dead and the dying. The few sailors still able to stand were ghostly figures, hollow-eyed with fever, their bodies covered in the ghastly black swellings. They could barely speak but gestured weakly for help. The Sicilian port authorities were horrified. They immediately understood that these ships carried not merchandise, but a terrifying and unknown sickness. In a desperate act of public health, they ordered the death ships, as they were quickly named, to be cast out of the harbour. The galleys, with their dying crews, were forced back to sea, to wander the Mediterranean until they were all consumed. But it was already too late. In the time the ships had been moored at the dock, a few hours at most, the escape had already begun. The first to disembark, unseen, were the rats. They scurried down the thick mooring ropes, melting into the shadows of the warehouses and docks of Messina. With them came their own passengers, the fleas, starved from their journey, their hosts dead or dying. They abandoned the cooling bodies of the ship's rats and sought out new warm-blooded hosts among the local rat population of the city. The exchange was made. The bacterium had successfully crossed the water. The beachhead was established. For a few days, the people of Messina may have thought they had avoided disaster. They had expelled the death ships. The danger had passed. But then the sickness began in the city itself, starting with those who lived and worked near the port. A docker would come home with a fever. A merchant's wife would discover a painful swelling in her neck. The pattern that had unfolded on the ships now began to repeat itself, but on a terrifying new scale. It moved with a speed that defied understanding, leaping from house to house, from street to street. The local physicians had never seen anything like it. Their traditional remedies, bloodletting, poultices, prayers, were utterly useless. The disease seemed to mock their efforts. Healthy people would go to bed at night and be dead by morning. Whole families were wiped out in a matter of days. Panic gave way to a paralyzing terror. People locked themselves in their homes, but the sickness seeped in through the walls. Others fled the city, hoping to outrun the plague by escaping to the countryside. But in doing so, they unwittingly became its agents, carrying the disease with them to the small villages and towns of Sicily, ensuring that the fire would not be contained. The citizens of Messina, in their terror, turned on each other and on outsiders, looking for someone to blame. But the enemy was invisible, silent, and already moving north up the boot of Italy, carried by coastal traders and fleeing refugees. The Black Death had arrived in Europe. The reckoning had begun. To understand the disaster that followed, you must first understand the killer, not as a demon or a divine punishment or a cloud of corrupted air, but as a living thing, a thing of exquisite, horrifying efficiency. Its scientific name is Yersinia pestis, a simple bacterium, a rod-shaped organism with no malice, no grand design, only a single unstoppable goal: to replicate. And in the 14th century, it found a world perfectly designed to help it achieve that singular goal. This microscopic predator did not, however, travel on the wind alone. It required a vehicle, a series of accomplices, each one perfectly suited for its role in the coming drama. The first accomplice is a creature barely larger than a grain of rice, the oriental rat flea, Xenocilla chaopes. This tiny insect is the plague's primary carrier, its bridge from one world to the next. The flea lives a simple life, feeding on the blood of its host. When it feeds on an infected animal, it sips not just blood, but a teeming soup of Yersinia pestis. Inside the flea's gut, the bacteria begin to multiply at an astonishing rate. They form a thick, jelly-like biofilm, a sticky mass that clogs the flea's proventriculus, a valve leading to its stomach. The flea is now blocked. It is hungrily, painfully starving, but it cannot swallow. It is doomed to starve, but in its final frantic days, it becomes the most dangerous thing on earth. It jumps from host to host, biting with a desperate intensity, and with each bite, it attempts to feed, but the blockage in its gut prevents the new blood from going down. Instead, the suction action draws the blood in. It mixes with the bacterial mass, and then the flea, in a spasm of frustration, throws up this infected slurry directly into the bite wound. A single blocked flea in its death throes can infect dozens of new hosts, each bite a microscopic injection of pure sickness. This brings us to the second accomplice, the flea's preferred ride and home, the black rat, Rattus rattus. This is not the common brown sewer rat of the modern world. The black rat, or roof rat, is a smaller, nimbler creature. It is a skilled climber with a preference for high places. It doesn't live in sewers. It lives in the very bones of human civilization. In the 14th century, it nested in the thatched roofs of peasant huts, in the attics of merchants' houses, in the dark corners of grain stores, and most importantly, in the holds of ships. It lived, slept, and bred just inches away from humanity, sharing their food, their warmth, and their filth, an invisible parallel civilization thriving in the walls and rafters. A rat might die from the plague, its fur swarming with newly homeless, starving fleas, and as its body cooled, these fleas would seek the nearest warm body they could find, a cat, a dog, or all too often the sleeping human family, just on the other side of the wall. Once the bacterium made this final jump from flea to human, the plague would show itself in one of three devastating forms. The most common, the one that gave the plague its name, was the bubonic form. After the flea's bite, The Yersinia pestis bacteria would not enter the bloodstream directly. Instead, they would travel through the lymphatic system, a silent internal river. Their destination was the nearest lymph node, the body's small bean-shaped fortresses of immune cells. But against this invader, the fortress was not a defense, it was a trap. The bacteria would overwhelm the node, causing it to swell with a horrible speed. This swelling, called a bubo, would erupt in the groin, the armpit, or on the neck, growing to the size of a chicken's egg or even an orange. It was filled with pus, blood, and a seething mass of bacteria, and it was painfully agonizing. The victim would be seized by a violent fever, chills, and vomiting. Dark bruises called petechiae would bloom on the skin, a result of bleeding under the skin. These dark patches, this token of God's wrath, likely gave the Black Death its name. Death, if it came, would usually arrive within a week. The bubonic form was hideously lethal, killing perhaps 60% of those infected. But some, a precious few, did survive. Their buboes would burst, drain, and they would slowly, painfully recover. They were the lucky ones. The second form was the septicemic plague. This was plague of the blood. Sometimes it evolved from an untreated bubonic case, the bacteria finally breaking free from the lymph node and storming the bloodstream. Other times, the bacteria were injected directly into a capillary by the flea, bypassing the lymphatic system altogether. In this form, there were no buboes. The body's defenses were overrun from the start. The bacteria multiplied with terrifying freedom in the blood itself, turning the circulatory system into a highway for death. The symptoms were swift and brutal, a soaring fever, extreme fatigue, and abdominal pain. The bacteria caused a condition known as disseminated intravascular coagulation, where tiny blood clots formed throughout the body, paradoxically leading to uncontrollable bleeding from the nose, the mouth, and under the skin. The flesh would darken and die as circulation failed, giving the victim a terrifying blackened appearance. The septicemic plague was almost always fatal. There was no time for the body to even mount the defense that created a bubo. Death was a certainty, often coming within a single day. But it was the third form, the pneumonic plague, that truly gave the sickness its apocalyptic speed and reach. This was the plague of the lungs. It would occur when a victim of the bubonic or septicemic forms developed a secondary infection in their respiratory system. But its true horror lay in its mode of transmission. Once the plague was in the lungs, it no longer needed the flea or the rat. It could travel through the air. The victim's cough would become a spray of bloody, frothy aerosol, each microscopic droplet laden with Yersinia pestis. Anyone who breathed in these droplets could catch the primary pneumonic plague directly. This form was the most infectious and the most lethal of all. Its symptoms included fever, headache, weakness, and chest pains, quickly followed by a cough that produced bloody sputum. From there, breathing became difficult, and the victim would essentially drown in their own fluids. The mortality rate was not 60% or even 90%. It was as close to 100% as any disease has ever been, and it killed with merciless speed, often in less than 48 hours. The pneumonic form allowed the plague to leap from person to person, untethered from its animal host, turning every crowded room, every winter church service, into a death trap. This was the engine of the unstoppable tide, the final piece of a biological puzzle so perfect in its lethality. It would bring a continent to its knees. The tide began its unstoppable creep into Europe in the autumn of 1347. This point of entry was not a grand battlefield or a royal court, but the busy, chaotic docks of Messina in Sicily. The agents of its arrival were a dozen Genoese trading galleys, limping home from the Black Sea port of Caffa, a fortified trading post on the Crimean Peninsula. They carried silks, spices, and a hidden cargo of infected rats and their attendant fleas. The story later told by the Italian notary, Gabriele de Mussi, of the Mongol army besieging Caffa and catapulting plague-ridden corpses over the walls, is a dramatic tale of early biological warfare. It may even be true, but in truth, the catapults were likely unnecessary. The rats, the natural fifth columnists of the medieval world, would have already slipped aboard the ships, drawn to the scent of grain and the promise of shelter. The Genoese sailors, thinking they had escaped the mysterious illness that had destroyed their ranks in Caffa, were in fact carrying the seeds of apocalypse within the very timbers of their vessels. When the ships arrived in Messina, the Sicilians were met with a ghastly sight. The galleys were ghost ships, many of their oarsmen already dead or dying. their bodies covered in the telltale black spots and agonizing swellings. The harbour authorities, in a panic, drove the ships away, but it was far, far too late. The rats had already scurried down the mooring ropes. The fleas had already found new hosts. The disease exploded through Messina with a fury that stunned the population. Michael of Piazza, a Franciscan friar, wrote of the terror. Realizing that this fatal evil had been introduced by the Genoese galleys, the people of Messina drove them out of the harbour. But the sickness remained, and a terrible mortality began. The plague did not move like a known sickness. It moved like a curse. A person could go to bed healthy and be dead by morning. Whole families were wiped out in a matter of days. From Sicily, the plague branched out, following the liquid highways of Mediterranean trade. Other fleeing ships from the east carried it to Genoa and Venice in northern Italy around January of 1348. These two great maritime republics, the engines of European commerce, became the primary distribution centres for the sickness. From Venice, the plague seeped into the Italian heartland, moving up the Po Valley. From Genoa, ships carried it west to the French port of Marseille. With each landing, the pattern repeated. A ship would arrive, a few sailors would stagger ashore, and within weeks the port city would be consumed. From Marseille, the plague began its devastating march north, following the Rhône River, a vital artery of trade. It reached the city of Avignon in the spring of 1348. At the time, Avignon was not just a city, it was the home of the papacy, the very heart of Western Christendom. Pope Clement VI, a man more accustomed to political intrigue than divine retribution, watched in horror as half his staff perished. He consecrated the entire Rhône River so that corpses could be thrown into it for a Christian burial as the cemeteries overflowed. He eventually survived by isolating himself in his chambers, sitting for months between two enormous roaring fires. A desperate, and as it happens, accidentally effective measure that likely kept the fleas at bay. The year 1348 was the year the fire truly took hold. While it ravaged Avignon, it pushed deeper into France, reaching the great city of Paris by the summer. It had travelled from the Mediterranean coast in less than 6 months. Paris was one of the largest and most densely populated cities in Europe, and the plague tore through its packed parishes, killing an estimated 800 people a day at its peak. Simultaneously, the infection spread from Italy's western coast to the great trading city of Pisa. From Pisa, it took to the sea again, infecting the islands of Corsica and Sardinia. It entered the Iberian Peninsula through the ports of Barcelona and Valencia, spreading like wildfire through the kingdoms of Aragon and Castile. Back in France, the plague had found its way to Bordeaux, a bustling port at the heart of the English-controlled territory of Gascony. It was from here, in the late spring of 1348, that the sickness prepared to cross the Channel. The primary export of Bordeaux was wine, and the ships that carried the wine to England carried death as well. Around the 24th of June, a ship docked at the small port of Melcombe Regis in what is now Dorset. A sailor, perhaps feeling a little unwell, stepped ashore. The Black Death had arrived in England. It spread slowly at first, creeping through the towns of the southwest, but by August it had reached Bristol, a major port with extensive trade links to the rest of the country and to Ireland. Once in Bristol, the plague had found a new distribution hub. It moved with terrifying speed along the coastal trading routes and inland river systems. It followed the Thames Valley east, directly towards London. The capital, a city of perhaps 70,000 souls, was gripped by fear long before the plague arrived. Rumours from the continent had been circulating for months. King Edward III's own daughter, Joan, had died of it in Bordeaux on her way to marry a Spanish prince. In the autumn of 1348, the first cases appeared in the city's crowded, filthy western parishes. As the weather cooled, the disease seemed to slow, giving a false sense of hope. This was merely a temporary break. The winter of 1348-49 was cold and damp, perfect conditions for the pneumonic form to take hold. In the close quarters of London's tenements, the plague began to spread not by flea bite, but by cough and by breath. When spring of 1349 arrived, the plague exploded with a ferocity that dwarfed anything seen before. It saturated London, forcing the creation of new mass graves, or plague pits, outside the city walls. From the capital, it radiated outwards in every direction. It moved north through East Anglia, devastating the agricultural heartland of the kingdom. It moved up through the Midlands, and by the summer, it was in York, the great capital of the north. It crossed into Wales, and via ships from Bristol, It landed in Ireland, where it destroyed the Anglo-Norman populations in the fortified towns, while the native Irish in the countryside were, for a time, relatively spared. A Welsh poet, Ewan Gethin, wrote of the buboes, "a seed of blackness, a sorrowful swelling," before he too died. By the end of 1349, all of England was in its grip, but the sickness was not finished. That same year, it crossed the North Sea. One story, perhaps made up but grimly believable, tells of a wool ship from London drifting aimlessly until it ran aground near Bergen, Norway. The locals who rowed out to investigate found a crew of dead men and a cargo of death. They brought the sickness ashore with them. From Norway, it spread to Sweden and Denmark. It also pushed into the vast territories of the Holy Roman Empire. It entered from the south, over the Alpine passes from Italy, and from the west, across the Rhine from France. In 1349, it fell upon Vienna, upon Hamburg, Cologne, and Bremen. For the people in these regions, its arrival was almost worse than for those it had struck first. They had listened for 2 long years to the terrifying rumours, praying they would be spared. Their dread had been a slow-burning fire. The plague's arrival was the inferno. By 1350, the Great Wave was beginning to break. It had washed over most of Western and Central Europe. It now lapped at the continent's northeastern shores. It finally reached the powerful trading cities of the Hanseatic League on the Baltic coast. From there, it pushed east. It was slower to penetrate Poland and Bohemia, perhaps due to lower population densities and less integrated trade networks. A small mercy in a merciless time. Finally, in 1351 and 1352, it reached the vast expanse of Russia, arriving in the trading hub of Novgorod and striking a final brutal blow against Moscow. In just under 5 years, a single bacterium, carried by a flea and a rat, had followed the arteries of human commerce and communication across an entire continent, from the shores of the Black Sea to the fjords of Norway, leaving a trail of unimaginable devastation. It had moved with the speed of a ship, the pace of a merchant's cart, and the intimacy of a human breath. It was an unstoppable tide, but it found in Europe's cities the perfect ground in which to become a flood. To ask why the Black Death was so devastating is to ask why a spark causes a wildfire. The spark was Yersinia pestis, but the kindling was the medieval city itself. A city like 14th century Paris, Florence, or London was not a place of grand boulevards and open squares. It was a tangled, organic growth of humanity. A maze of life compressed within ancient defensive walls. The streets were narrow, winding alleys, not designed for traffic, but for the passage of a person or a mule. The upper stories of the timber-framed houses leaned out over the street, an architectural feature called a jetty, until they nearly touched those across the way, blocking out the sun and creating a constant twilight at ground level. This claustrophobic design had a chilling side effect. It kept the air stagnant and close, a perfect environment for the transmission of airborne disease. The sensory experience of such a place would be overwhelming to a modern visitor, and the most powerful sensation would be the smell. There was no concept of public sanitation. The streets were the sewers. Household waste, from rotting vegetable scraps to the contents of chamber pots, was simply tossed out the window, often with a cursory shout of "Gardez-le," a corruption of the French "garde l'eau," or "watch out for the water." This foul slurry, a mixture of human waste, animal dung from the countless horses and oxen, and offal from butcher stalls, would coat the cobblestones or churn in the mud of the unpaved lanes. Rivers like the Thames in London or the Seine in Paris were not sources of fresh water. They were open sewers, thick with filth, into which tanners scraped their chemicals and slaughterhouses dumped blood and entrails. This ever-present layer of organic waste was a paradise for the black rat. It offered an endless, convenient buffet, allowing rat populations to swell to incredible densities, living not at a distance from humans, but in a state of intimate, unavoidable cohabitation. The rats thrived in the filth, and the fleas thrived on the rats. Inside the houses, conditions were no better. A typical urban family lived in a single small room, often sharing it with lodgers to help pay the rent. These rooms were dark, poorly ventilated, and crowded. The floors were covered not with wooden boards, but with straw or rushes, which were rarely changed. This bedding collected spilled food, dirt, and parasites, becoming a warm, ideal nesting ground for fleas. A flea that dropped from a dying rat in the thatch above would not have to look far for its next meal. The close quarters meant the plague, once it entered a household, could tear through it in days. The pneumonic form, in particular, turned every crowded tenement into a death sentence. A single cough from one family member could condemn everyone else in the room. There was no public health infrastructure to combat such a crisis. The very concept of germ theory lay centuries in the future. The prevailing medical belief was the theory of miasma. The disease was caused by bad air, a poisonous vapor or mist filled with particles from decomposing matter. Physicians, their faces buried in beaked masks stuffed with sweet-smelling herbs, believed they were filtering out this corrupt air. Their remedies were based on this flawed premise. They advised people to burn aromatic woods like juniper, or to carry bouquets of flowers, known as posies, to ward off the stench and the sickness itself. These measures were tragically useless. While people were sniffing flowers, the fleas were jumping, and the bacteria were spreading. Hospitals of the era were not places of healing in the modern sense. They were charitable institutions, often run by the church, designed to provide comfort and care for the poor and the dying. They were hospices, not houses of recovery. When the plague struck, these places became centers of infection, concentrating the sick and the dying together and ensuring the disease would spread efficiently among the caregivers and other patients. The social and economic fabric of the city also contributed to its vulnerability. Cities were magnets, drawing a constant stream of people from the countryside seeking work or trade. They were nodes in a vast network of commerce, with goods and people flowing in and out every single day. A shipment of wool from Flanders, a cask of wine from Gascony, a bolt of silk from Italy. Each could carry stowaway rats. The grain stores needed to feed the dense urban population were a particular point of weakness, acting as five-star hotels for ratus, guaranteeing a large, centralized, and well-fed population of carriers right in the heart of the city. Consider Florence in 1348. The city was a jewel of the Renaissance, a hub of banking, art, and intellectual life. It was also a perfect urban tinderbox. Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through it, left an unforgettable account in the introduction to his Decameron. He describes a society utterly unraveling. The scale of death was so immense that all social norms collapsed. He wrote of the dead being piled up outside houses, of carts roaming the streets at dawn to collect the corpses. He tells of mass graves being dug in which they heaped up the bodies by the hundred, like goods in a ship's hold. He describes the terror and the abandonment. Brother was forsaken by brother, nephew by uncle, sister by brother, and often husband by wife. Nay, what is more, and scarcely to be believed, fathers and mothers were found to abandon their own children, untended, unvisited, to their fate. In London, the existing cemeteries filled up almost immediately. The city was forced to purchase land outside the walls to serve as emergency burial grounds. One such plot, at East Smithfield, was excavated by archaeologists in the 1980s. They found the skeletons of men, women, and children, laid out in neat, orderly rows, 5 deep. It was a testament not only to the horrific number of dead, but also to the desperate, heroic effort of the living to maintain some semblance of order and dignity in the face of utter chaos. The medieval city, a symbol of progress, of commerce and of civilization, had become its own worst enemy. The very things that made it a city, the density of its population, the concentration of its trade, the interconnectedness of its people, were the very things that made it the perfect ecosystem for the plague. The microscopic killer, born on its flea and rat chariot, had travelled along the grand trade routes of a confident and expanding Europe, and upon arriving, it found in the continent's dark, crowded, and vibrant cities not a fortress, but a feast. In the face of this silent, creeping enemy, the learned men of Europe reached for their scrolls and scalpels, for the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 years, and they found it wanting. The physicians, dressed in their long robes, their faces grim, stood by the bedsides of the dying and saw not a disease, but a fundamental betrayal of nature itself. Their entire understanding of the human body was built upon a delicate classical elegance, the system of the 4 humours, inherited from the great Galen of Pergamon. To be healthy was to be in balance. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, each corresponding to an element and a season, were meant to exist in a perfect, harmonious balance within the vessel of the body. Sickness was simply a state of imbalance, a lack of harmony. A common fever might be an excess of blood, a sad mood, an abundance of black bile. The remedies were, in their own way, logical. Too much of one humour? You simply had to remove it. But the pestilence, this was no simple imbalance. It was a storm. It threw the body into a violent, chaotic state that defied their neat categories. Was the blackening of the flesh from the buboes an excessive black bile, the humour of sadness and death? Perhaps. So they tried to correct it. They prescribed cheerful music, forbade depressing thoughts, and instructed patients to think only of beautiful things, as if one could simply will the humours back into alignment. They advised against bathing, a common medieval practice, believing that opening the pores in hot water would make the body more vulnerable to the corrupted air outside. The stench of unwashed cities grew deeper, more profound. The prevailing theory, the one that seized the imagination of scholar and peasant alike, was the doctrine of miasma. It was the belief that the plague was carried on the air itself. Bad air, a sickness-carrying vapour that rose from stagnant water, from rotting corpses, from the unhealthy alignment of the planets, or even from the very bowels of the earth, released by earthquakes. It was, in a way, terrifyingly close to the truth, yet fundamentally wrong. They could smell death in the air. The sweet, cloying odour of decay was inescapable in any plague-stricken town, and they concluded, not unreasonably, that the smell itself was the killer. The cause was mistaken for the effect. This belief shaped the entire medical and public response. Physicians walked the streets holding pomanders, small, ornate metal balls filled with ambergris, cloves and other powerful aromatics, to their noses, creating a small personal bubble of good air to ward off the miasma. Cities lit enormous bonfires in the streets, hoping the smoke and heat would cleanse the atmosphere. Pope Clement VI, hidden away in his grand palace in Avignon, survived the plague by spending the entire summer of 1348 sitting between two massive roaring fires. His physicians, having advised him that the intense heat would purify the air entering his chambers. It was a strategy of the rich, an attempt to build a fortress of clean air. For the common person, the advice was simpler. Hold a cloth soaked in vinegar to your face, or carry a pocket full of posies, their sweet scent a fragile shield against the invisible poison. And then there were the treatments. When a patient was brought forth, feverish and terrified, the buboes already swelling in their groin or armpit, the doctor would unroll his kit of polished metal tools. The first and most common response was phlebotomy, or bloodletting. Believing the plague to be a hot and wet disease, an excess of blood, they would open a vein, often on the opposite side of the body from the bubo, and drain the patient's blood into a bowl. They let it flow until the patient, already weakened by fever and infection, grew faint. They were, with the best of intentions, draining the very life and strength from the afflicted, hastening the end they were so desperate to prevent. If veins were not an option, they turned to leeches, applying the hungry creatures to the skin to suck out the corrupted blood. The buboes themselves, the great dark swellings that gave the bubonic plague its name, were a source of intense focus. They were seen as the body's attempt to expel the poison. Therefore, the physician's job was to help it along. This meant lancing the buboes, taking a sharp, clean blade, a small mercy. They would slice into the swollen lymph node, a procedure of excruciating pain, releasing a torrent of foul-smelling pus and blood. To draw out the venom further, they would apply poultices. These were not gentle herbal compresses. They were bizarre and often disgusting mixtures. Mixtures of tree resin and lily root, or more desperately, plasters made from dried human waste and figs. One popular treatment involved taking a live pigeon, cutting it open, and applying its warm, bleeding flesh directly to the bubo in the belief that the bird would draw the poison out into its own body. For those who could afford it, the remedies became more exotic and more useless. Potions containing crushed emeralds were prescribed. The sheer cost of the ingredients meant to signal their power. Theriac, a complex medical compound originating from ancient Rome, was in high demand. It was a thick, honey-based jam containing dozens, sometimes hundreds of ingredients, including cinnamon, opium, and most famously, the flesh of vipers. It was a cure-all, a universal antidote, and it did absolutely nothing against Yersinia pestis. The most famous physician of the age, Guy de Chauliac, left a stark and honest account of this medical helplessness. As Pope Clement's personal doctor, he was at the very heart of the crisis in Avignon. He observed the plague with a clinical eye, even correctly distinguishing between the two main forms, the bubonic with its swellings and fevers, and the far more deadly pneumonic form, which attacked the lungs, was spread by coughing, and killed with terrifying speed. He wrote with a weariness that echoes across the centuries. The plague was so contagious that one man could infect the whole world. He noted that doctors dared not visit the sick for fear of infection, and when they did, they could do nothing for them. De Chauliac himself caught the plague. He was ill for 6 weeks with a continuous fever and a bubo in his groin. He treated himself with the methods of his time, lancing his own bubo, and against all odds, he survived. He attributed his survival to the grace of God, not to his own medical arts. He admitted the futility, the shame of it all. And I, to avoid shame, dared not absent myself, but with continual fear, I preserved myself as best I could. It was an admission of utter defeat. The healers were helpless. Their books held no answers. Their potions were worthless. Their theories of miasma and humours were elegant fictions in the face of a brutal biological reality. And as the physicians stepped back from the bedsides, their hands stained with blood and useless herbs, the people, consumed by a fear far greater than any fever, lifted their eyes from the earth and looked to the heavens, searching for an explanation and for a mercy that was nowhere to be found. When the most learned physicians could offer only pain and poison, when the air itself was believed to be a killer, it was only natural that people saw a force at work far beyond the realm of medicine. This was not a sickness of the body, it was a sickness of the soul, a judgment rendered on a planetary scale. The Black Death was understood by almost everyone, from the simplest farmer to the most powerful king, as a divine punishment. It was Flagellum Day, the scourge of God, a biblical plague made real. Mankind, in its vanity, its greed, and its endless sinning, had finally provoked the wrath of the Almighty. The sermons of priests, once filled with comforting words of salvation, now thundered with condemnation. They pointed to the vanity of new fashions, the moral decay of the cities, the endless wars between Christian princes. Every sin, large and small, was another log on the pyre of God's anger. But if this was God's punishment, then the established church, God's representative on earth, seemed utterly incapable of stopping it. Prayers went unanswered. Masses were sung in plague-choked cathedrals to no effect. The sick were anointed with holy oil, given their last rites, and they died anyway. The priests themselves were dying at a catastrophic rate, often among the first to perish as they moved bravely among the sick and dying to offer comfort. In some dioceses, the mortality rate for clergy approached 70%. This pastoral bravery created a vacuum. To fill the ranks, bishops were forced to ordain men who were barely literate, young men with little training and less moral authority. The quality of the clergy plummeted, a decline that would have consequences for centuries to come, eroding public trust and respect for the institution. The church, the great spiritual fortress of medieval life, was being hollowed out from the inside. Into this vacuum of authority and explanation stepped one of the most extraordinary and terrifying movements of the Middle Ages. The Flagellants. This was not a new phenomenon. Self-punishment as a form of repentance had a long history, but the Black Death gave it an apocalyptic urgency and a terrifying scale. The movement appeared to explode out of Germany in 1348, a spontaneous, hysterical expression of collective guilt and terror. They were processions of people, mostly men, who marched from town to town in a highly ritualized performance of public suffering. They would arrive in a town square, form a large circle, and strip to the waist, leaving only a linen cloth from their waist to their ankles. Then, as their leader chanted prayers and confessed their sins, they would begin to whip themselves. The whips were not simple branches. They were leather scourges with 3 or more tails, and each tail was embedded with sharp pieces of iron. With each swing, the metal points would bite into the flesh of their backs, and they would continue, rhythmically, relentlessly, until their bodies were a bloody pulped mess. They would throw themselves to the ground in choreographed patterns, sometimes in the shape of a cross, while their master continued the ritual, crying out for God's mercy. For the terrified townspeople who watched, this was a powerful, horrifying spectacle. Here were men willing to take on the sins of the world, to offer their own blood as a sacrifice to appease an angry God. When a town was in the grip of the plague, and the church bells tolled ceaselessly for the dead, the arrival of the Flagellants must have seemed like the only hope. They were welcomed, fed, and sheltered, seen as living saints, their bloody penance a shield for the community. But the movement soon grew beyond the control of any authority. The Flagellants developed their own theology, their own hymns, and their own leaders who claimed to have received letters directly from heaven. They taught that their ritual, performed for 33.5 days, 1 day for each year of Christ's life on earth, could wash away all sin, bypassing the need for priests or the sacraments of the church. This was direct heresy. They disrupted services, challenged the authority of local clergy, and their mass gatherings, moving from an infected town to a clean one, were a perfect mechanism for spreading the very plague they sought to end. Pope Clement VI, watching the chaos unfold from his palace in Avignon, quickly recognized the danger. He saw a revolutionary movement that threatened the very foundations of the Church's authority. In October 1349, he issued a papal bull, a formal decree condemning the Flagellants. He forbade them from marching, declared them heretics, and called upon the secular authorities to suppress them. By then, the mood had already begun to turn. The plague did not stop. The Flagellants' sacrifices were in vain. The initial awe they inspired curdled into suspicion and fear. They were no longer seen as saints, but as dangerous fanatics, vagabonds, and troublemakers. Once welcomed, they were now driven from towns by force. The movement, born of apocalyptic terror, burned itself out with astonishing speed, its members scattering back into the traumatized landscape from which they had emerged. The crisis of faith was profound and many-sided. It wasn't that people stopped believing in God. On the contrary, their belief was more intense and fearful than ever. What was shattered was their confidence in the institutions that claimed to understand God's will. The Church had promised that piety, prayer, and penance were the path to salvation and divine favor. Yet the plague was random. It took the devout nun and the drunken sinner, the innocent child and the corrupt merchant. It struck down priests at the altar. This randomness was spiritually devastating. It suggested a God who was not just angry, but unpredictable, distant, and perhaps, worst of all, indifferent. This deep-seated spiritual trauma, this sense of abandonment by the established order of heaven and earth, created a fertile ground for doubt. It was a wound in the psyche of Christendom, a crack in the monolithic authority of the Church that would widen over the coming centuries, eventually breaking open in the fires of the Reformation. The world no longer felt stable, its rules no longer certain. And in such a world where the doctors were powerless and God was silent, the terrified human mind, desperate for an answer, for a cause it could understand and fight, began to search for a new enemy. It looked not for a sin, but for a sinner. It looked for a scapegoat. When the heavens offered no comfort and the earth offered no cure, the fear that gripped Europe needed a target. It required a human face. An incomprehensible, invisible killer that struck without reason was a terror too abstract to bear. The terrified mind demands a conspiracy, a plot, a tangible enemy that can be confronted and destroyed. And in the social landscape of 14th century Europe, there was a group that had, for centuries, been cast as the ultimate other, a people set apart by faith, custom and law, the Jews. They lived in segregated quarters, were barred from most professions, and were subjected to a constant barrage of religious propaganda that painted them as malevolent outsiders, the historical enemies of Christ. They were the perfect canvas onto which a panicked society could project its darkest fears. The rumour began as a whisper, likely in the south of France, and it spread with a speed and virulence that rivaled the plague itself. It was a simple, monstrous accusation. The Jews were causing the sickness by poisoning the wells. They were, the story went, engaged in a vast international conspiracy to exterminate the Christians of Europe. Agents were said to be travelling from city to city, depositing packages of a deadly poison, a concoction allegedly made from spiders, owls and the hearts of Christians into the wells, rivers and springs that provided drinking water to the towns. It was a story that required a complete suspension of logic. It ignored the fact that Jewish communities were also being devastated by the plague, often suffering even higher mortality rates due to their cramped and often unsanitary living conditions in the ghettos. But in a climate of mass hysteria, logic is the first casualty. The accusation provided a simple, satisfying answer to a terrifying question. It replaced an act of God, or an act of nature, with an act of man, and an act of man could be avenged. The first major outbreak of violence was ignited by a formal investigation. In September of 1348, at Chillon Castle on the shores of Lake Geneva, a number of local Jews were arrested and interrogated under torture by the local lord. The medieval system of justice placed an enormous value on confession, and torture was a brutally effective tool for producing whatever confession the authorities wished to hear. Broken on the rack, one man, a physician named Balavignus, confessed to the entire plot. He described the poison, named his accomplices, and laid out the sprawling conspiracy. These forced confessions were meticulously recorded, copied, and circulated to other cities as official, legally sanctioned proof of Jewish guilt. The documents from Chillon acted as a death warrant for thousands. The news spread up the Rhine River Valley into Switzerland and Germany, igniting pogroms of unimaginable savagery. The violence was not random mob action. It was often methodical, organized, and sanctioned by local guilds and town councils who saw an opportunity to cancel debts owed to Jewish moneylenders and seize their property. The pattern became horrifyingly familiar. In Basel, Switzerland, the city's entire Jewish population of several hundred was rounded up, herded into a specially constructed wooden building on an island in the Rhine, and burned alive in January 1349. In Freiburg and Augsburg, the story was the same. The massacre at Strasbourg was a particularly chilling example of this premeditated slaughter. The plague had not yet even arrived in the city, but the rumors and the hysteria had. The city's trade guilds, who were deeply indebted to Jewish moneylenders, demanded action against the city's Jewish population. The town's patrician leaders initially tried to protect them, arguing for their innocence, but the mob, whipped into a frenzy by the guilds and wandering preachers, would not be denied. The old city council was overthrown, and a new one, compliant with the guild's demands, was installed. On February 14, 1349, St. Valentine's Day, the city's Jewish community, nearly 2,000 men, women, and children, were marched to their own cemetery. There, a massive wooden platform had been erected. Those who agreed to convert to Christianity were spared, their children forcibly taken from them to be baptized and raised as Christians. The vast majority, however, refused. They were bound and forced onto the platform, and the structure was set alight. It was a holocaust, a mass execution conducted with bureaucratic efficiency. The property of the murdered was divided up among the citizens, their debts declared void. A few weeks later, the Black Death arrived in Strasbourg. Throughout the Rhineland, the story repeated itself. In Cologne, the Jewish community, forewarned, tried to fight back, but they were overwhelmed and slaughtered. In Mainz, home to one of the oldest and most respected Jewish communities in Europe, the Jews also took up arms. In a desperate act of self-defense, they killed some 200 of the approaching Christian mob. But this only enraged the attackers further. A massive force of citizens descended upon the Jewish quarter, and in the ensuing massacre, one of the largest of the plague years, the entire community of some 6,000 people was exterminated. In many places, facing certain death at the hands of the mob, entire communities chose to take their own lives. In a final tragic act of defiance and faith, they would set fire to their own homes and synagogues, choosing to die by their own hands rather than be murdered or forced to abandon their religion. There were voices of sanity, but they were few and they were faint, easily drowned out by the roar of the crowd. Pope Clement VI in Avignon issued 2 papal bulls in 1348 declaring the Jews innocent of the well-poisoning charges. He stated the obvious, that the plague was God's will and that Jews were dying from it just as Christians were. He threatened anyone who harmed them with excommunication. Some rulers, like Duke Albrecht II of Austria and King Casimir the Great of Poland, offered protection and refuge, and Jewish refugees fled eastward, creating new centers of Jewish life in Poland and Lithuania that would flourish for centuries. But in the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, in the free cities of Germany and Switzerland, the Pope's decrees were ignored. Local authority, popular hatred, and naked greed proved to be a far more powerful force than a distant papal edict. The persecution was a grim chapter in a long history of anti-Semitism, but the Black Death gave it a unique and horrific intensity. It demonstrated the terrifying power of a conspiracy theory to rationalize the irrational. It was easier for many to believe in a vast network of human evil than in a microscopic organism or the inscrutable will of God. Blaming the Jews provided a sense of agency in a situation of complete powerlessness. It turned passive victims of a disease into active participants in a holy war. By killing the enemy, they believed they were cleansing their community, purifying it, and perhaps even appeasing the God who had seemingly abandoned them. But the wells remained poisoned, not by any human hand, but by a world that had been fundamentally and irrevocably altered. The fires that consumed the Jewish communities of the Rhineland did nothing to stop the plague, but they left a permanent stain on the soul of Europe, a chilling testament to the fact that the most dangerous sickness of all is not the one that attacks the body, but the one that feeds on fear and infects the human heart. The very fabric of the world, it seemed, was coming undone, not with a great tear, but with a slow, silent unravelling of threads one by one. In the cities, where humanity had so proudly packed itself in, the silence was the most profound change. Before, the soundscape of a place like Florence or Paris was one of constant motion. The clatter of wagon wheels on cobblestones, the cries of vendors, the hammering of a blacksmith, the distant peal of church bells marking the hours. Now, the bells tolled for one reason only. They tolled ceaselessly, a monotonous clanging death knell that became the new rhythm of life until there were not enough living to ring them for the dead. Then even that sound faded. The silence that replaced it was heavy, thick with a fear so palpable you could almost taste it on the air, metallic and sour, like old blood. The Florentine chronicler, Giovanni Boccaccio, who watched his own city disintegrate, tried to capture the sheer psychological vertigo of it all. He described a world where the laws of God and man simply ceased to function, not because they were overthrown, but because there was no one left to enforce them and no one left who cared. Ministers of the law, notaries and officials, he wrote, had either died or were so bereft of staff that they could not attend to their duties. The result was a chilling liberty, where every person was free to do as they pleased. For some, this meant a descent into raw, unbridled hedonism. They roamed from tavern to tavern, which were often abandoned, drinking whatever they could find. They moved into the empty homes of the wealthy, taking possession of grand villas and living in opulent squalor for a few days, a week, a month, until the telltale buboes appeared on them too. They held drunken parties, convinced that laughter and song and wine were the best medicine against the sadness of the plague. It was a frantic, desperate kind of joy, a final dance on the edge of the abyss. For others, the response was the polar opposite. They locked themselves away, becoming hermits in their own homes. They ate the most delicate foods and drank the finest wines in extreme moderation, refusing to speak with anyone from the outside world. They would not hear news of the sick or the dead and passed their time with music and prayer, creating a tiny, fragile bubble of order in a universe of chaos. And then there were those who walked a middle path, carrying flowers or scented herbs, holding them to their noses as they walked the empty streets, believing the sweet perfumes could ward off the stench of death and the sickness, carrying air itself. All of them, the hedonist, the hermit, the perfumed walker, were equal in the eyes of the plague. It took them all. The most sacred bonds, those of family and kinship, dissolved like salt in water. Boccaccio tells us with a kind of stunned horror, the brother abandoned brother, the uncle his nephew, the sister her brother, and very often the wife her husband. But the most terrible thing, the most unnatural act of all, he wrote, was that fathers and mothers refused to nurse and assist their own children, as though they were not their own. Imagine that. The primal, instinctual love of a parent for a child, a bond forged in biology and culture for millennia, simply evaporated in the face of this invisible terror. A child would fall ill, crying for its mother, in a house suddenly too large and too quiet, and the mother, listening from another room, would steel her heart, lock the door, and flee, saving herself. The sick were left to fend for themselves, their only companions the rats skittering in the walls. If they were lucky, a servant might bring them food, tempted by a high wage, but more often than not, they died alone. Commerce, the lifeblood of the medieval city, seized up entirely. Workshops were shuttered, their masters and apprentices either dead or in hiding. The great marketplaces of Siena and Ghent, usually teeming with merchants from across the known world, stood vacant. Grass began to grow between the flagstones. Ships rotted at their moorings in Bristol and Genoa, their crews dead, their precious cargoes of spice and silk untouched. Money became almost meaningless. What good was a purse full of silver florins when there was no bread to buy, no physician willing to make a house call, no priest to give you last rites? The economy reverted to its most basic form, survival. The disposal of the dead became a problem of grim logistics. At first, they tried to maintain tradition. Each corpse was given a coffin, a funeral procession, a proper Christian burial in consecrated ground. But the numbers quickly became overwhelming. The churchyards filled, then overflowed. The solution was as brutal as it was necessary: plague pits. Huge trenches were dug outside the city walls. At night, men known as bikini, often criminals or those so destitute they had nothing left to lose, would come with their carts, crying, "Bring out your dead." Families would drag the bodies of their loved ones from their homes and leave them on the doorstep. The bikini would pile them onto the carts, men, women, children, rich and poor, all jumbled together in the stiff, awkward postures of death. They would be taken to the pits and layered, like in Boccaccio's stark phrase, lasagna with cheese. A layer of bodies, a layer of dirt, a layer of bodies, a layer of dirt. All dignity was gone. All identity was erased. You were simply part of the count. In Avignon, the papal city, the Pope consecrated the entire Rhone River so that bodies could be thrown into it and still be considered buried on holy ground. The river became a flowing cemetery. The psychological toll was immense. People saw God's wrath in the plague, a punishment for their wickedness. Processions of Flagellants appeared, whipping themselves through the streets, their backs raw and bloody, hoping their self-inflicted penance could appease an angry deity. Yet they often did more to spread the disease than to stop it, moving from town to town. Others turned on their neighbours. In a desperate search for a scapegoat, communities across Europe, particularly in the Rhineland and France, latched onto a familiar target: the Jewish people. Vicious, unfounded rumours spread that they had caused the plague by poisoning the wells. It was a fantasy born of terror and ingrained prejudice. Entire Jewish communities were annihilated. In Strasbourg, in February 1349, 2,000 Jews were burned alive in their own cemetery. In Mainz, the largest Jewish community in Europe fought back, but were ultimately overwhelmed and slaughtered. The pogroms were a dark stain on an already dark time, a testament to the fact that when human beings are terrified, their first instinct is often not to come together, but to tear one another apart. The world had not just been turned upside down, it had been shattered, and the pieces could never be put back together in quite the same way. When the great silence finally began to recede, as the sickness burned itself out in one region and moved to the next, the survivors crept out of their homes and hiding places to survey the wreckage. They were a minority. In many places, fewer than half the people who had greeted the year 1347 were still alive to see 1351. They were inheritors of a world that was empty, yet full of opportunity. They walked through streets where every third or fourth house was vacant, its owners and all their kin gone. They saw fields stretching to the horizon, overgrown with weeds, the ploughs rusting where they lay, the lord of the manor and his entire family buried in the same pit as the humblest of his serfs. This vast, silent emptiness was the crucible in which the modern world would be forged. For the first time in centuries, there was a surplus of one thing, land, and a desperate shortage of another, people. This simple, brutal arithmetic upended the very foundation of medieval society, the feudal system. For 1,000 years, European life had been built on a rigid pyramid of obligation. At the bottom were the serfs, the vast majority of the population. They were tied to the land, unable to leave without their lord's permission. They worked his fields, gave him a share of their meagre crops, and in return received his protection and a small plot of land to sustain their own families. It was a system built on an abundance of labour and a scarcity of land. The Black Death flipped that equation on its head. Suddenly, labour was the scarce and precious commodity. A lord might own 1,000 acres, but it was worthless without hands to plough the fields, sow the seeds, and reap the harvest. The surviving peasants understood this. They might not have been educated in economics, but they understood the immediate, tangible reality of their new power. They were in demand. A peasant working his family's ancestral strip of land on a manor in Kent might hear that the lord of the next manor over was offering twice the wages for a day's work. More than that, he was offering freedom, no more obligations, no more unpaid labour on the lord's domain. Just a simple, clean contract, your labour for my coin. And so, for the first time, peasants began to vote with their feet. They packed their few belongings and walked away from the land that had held their families captive for generations, seeking a better deal. The lords, desperate to keep their lands productive, were forced to compete with one another. Wages for ploughmen, reapers and thatchers skyrocketed. In some places, they doubled or even tripled in the years immediately following the plague. The cost of livestock, on the other hand, plummeted. There were so many untended animals wandering the countryside that a horse that might have cost 40 shillings before the plague could now be bought for less than 7. A peasant could suddenly afford to buy his own animals, rent his own land, and work for himself. The chains of serfdom began to rust and break. The ruling class, the nobility, and the monarchy saw this shift not as a natural economic adjustment, but as a threat to the very order of the universe. To them, the social hierarchy was divinely ordained. A peasant was born to be a peasant. A lord was born to be a lord. This sudden empowerment of the lower classes was an affront to God and nature. Their response was not to adapt, but to legislate. In England, in 1351, King Edward III enacted the Statute of Labourers. It was a stunningly tone-deaf piece of legislation. It attempted to freeze all wages at their pre-plague levels. It made it illegal for a peasant to leave his master's land in search of better pay, and illegal for a lord to offer it. It was, in essence, an attempt to turn back the clock, to legally chain the economic genie back in its bottle. It failed utterly. The law was unenforceable. The economic reality of supply and demand was far more powerful than any royal decree. Lords quietly ignored the law, paying high wages under the table to attract workers. Peasants continued to abandon manners that tried to enforce the old ways. The statute only served to breed resentment, a simmering anger among the peasantry who saw the law for what it was, an attempt by the rich to hoard the world's wealth and deny them their fair share. This tension boiled over in the decades that followed. A new generation was born that had not experienced the plague firsthand, but had grown up in its aftermath, a world of higher wages and greater expectations. They were more literate, more politically aware, and less willing to accept the old injustices. Preachers like John Ball travelled the English countryside, spreading a radical new ideology. When Adam delved and Eve span, he famously asked, who was then the gentleman? His message was one of primitive equality, that the entire structure of nobility and serfdom was a fraud perpetrated on the people. This simmering discontent finally erupted in the summer of 1381 with the English Peasants' Revolt, sparked by the imposition of a deeply unpopular poll tax. Tens of thousands of peasants from Kent and Essex, led by men like Wat Tyler, marched on London. They were not just a disorganised mob, they were a disciplined force with clear demands. An end to serfdom, the abolition of the hated labour laws, and the seizure of church lands. They captured the Tower of London, dragged the Archbishop of Canterbury and the King's treasurer out, and beheaded them on Tower Hill. For a few terrifying days, they controlled the capital. The young King Richard II met with them, promising to grant all their demands. It was a lie. At a second meeting, Wat Tyler was killed, and the rebellion was brutally crushed. But while the revolt failed in the short term, its message lingered. The old system was broken. The manorial economy, with its foundation of unpaid serf labour, was dying. Over the next century, it would slowly be replaced by a system of cash rents and wage labour, the precursor to modern capitalism. The Black Death did not cause this change alone, but it acted as a ferocious catalyst, accelerating a process that might otherwise have taken centuries. It had cleared the board, allowing new pieces to be put into play, and yet, just as Europe began to painfully rebuild itself, to stitch together a new social and economic order from the ruins of the old, the nightmare returned. The Great Sickness of 1347 to 1351 was not a singular, isolated event. It was merely the cataclysmic opening act of a drama that would play out for the next 400 years. The bacterium Yersinia pestis had found a permanent home in Europe's black rat population and the fleas they carried. It now existed as an endemic disease, flaring up periodically in devastating epidemics. The plague became a recurring character in the story of European life, a terrifying ghost that would reappear every 10 to 20 years to haunt a new generation. There was the pestis secunda of the 1360s, a wave that was particularly lethal to children, and the pestis tertia in the 1370s, and so on, a relentless, pulsating cycle of death. Each outbreak was a fresh trauma, reopening old wounds and reminding everyone of their profound vulnerability. These later plagues, while often more localized, could be just as ferocious as the first. The Great Plague of Seville in 1649 wiped out nearly half the city's population, a loss from which the Great Spanish Port never fully recovered. But perhaps the most infamous of these later visitations was the Great Plague of London in 1665. The city had grown massively since the 14th century, a sprawling, overcrowded metropolis of narrow streets and timber-framed houses. It was a perfect incubator for disease. The outbreak began in the spring, in the poor, crowded parish of St. Giles in the Fields. At first, the authorities tried to suppress the news, but the weekly bills of mortality, the city's official death count, told a story that could not be hidden. The numbers began to climb: 43 in May, over 500 in June, 6,000 in July, 17,000 in August. At its peak in September, over 7,000 people died in a single week. The city descended into a familiar nightmare, a grim echo of 1348. The rich, including King Charles II and his court, fled to the countryside. The poor were left behind. The Lord Mayor ordered a series of desperate public health measures. Houses containing the sick were to be sealed and marked with a large red cross on the door, alongside the words, "Lord, have mercy upon us." Watchmen were posted outside to ensure that no one, sick or healthy, could leave the infected house for 40 days. It was a brutal, state-enforced imprisonment, and often a death sentence for the entire family trapped inside. Carts roamed the streets at night, their drivers calling out, "Bring out your dead," just as they had done 3 centuries before. The novelist Daniel Defoe, who was a small child during the plague, later wrote A Journal of the Plague Year, a masterpiece of historical fiction that vividly captured the atmosphere of fear and suspicion. He described the eerie silence of the once bustling Thames, the grass growing in the streets of Whitehall, the sound of wailing from the sealed houses, and the endless procession of carts heading towards the plague pits at Aldgate. The 1665 plague killed an estimated 100,000 people in London, roughly a quarter of its population. The Great Fire of London that followed in 1666, while a disaster in its own right, may have inadvertently helped to end the epidemic by burning down the crowded, rat-infested slums and allowing the city to be rebuilt with wider streets and brick houses. But between the first great wave and the last flickers of the second pandemic, something crucial began to change. The initial response to the plague in the 14th century had been one of religious panic, fatalism, and scapegoating. Society was helpless, but over the centuries, as the plague returned again and again, a slow, painful, and often brutal process of learning began. Humanity started to fight back, not with prayers and flagellation, but with observation, organization, and public policy. The very concept of public health was born from the crucible of the recurring plague. The first great innovation was quarantine. The idea was simple and rational. Isolate the potentially infected before they can spread the disease. The maritime republic of Ragusa on the Dalmatian coast was one of the first to pioneer this. In 1377, its chief physician, Jacob of Padua, advised the city council to establish a control for all incoming trade. They decreed that any ship arriving from a plague-ridden area had to anchor at a nearby island and wait for 30 days, a Trentino, before its crew and cargo would be allowed to enter the city. This was later extended to 40 days, or a quarantino, from which we get our modern word quarantine. The great trading rival of Ragusa, Venice, soon adopted and perfected the system. They established the world's first permanent plague hospital, or lazaretto, on an island in the Venetian lagoon in 1423. It was a dedicated facility for isolating and treating the sick, a radical idea at the time. By the 15th century, major Italian city-states like Florence and Milan had established permanent magistracies of health, or health boards. These were powerful civic bodies with sweeping authority during an epidemic. They could impose quarantines, regulate the disposal of the dead, close down public gatherings, and deploy a new, fearsome figure: the plague doctor. The plague doctor, with his long bird-like mask, is one of the most enduring and terrifying images of the era. The costume, likely developed in the 17th century by the French physician Charles de Lorme, was an early and unsettling attempt at personal protective equipment. The long beak of the mask was stuffed with aromatic herbs, straw, and spices like mint, cloves, and camphor, which were believed to purify the foul, miasmatic air that was thought to carry the disease. The doctor wore a long waxed leather coat, leggings, gloves, and a wide-brimmed hat to minimize his exposure to the sick. He carried a long wooden stick so he could examine patients without having to touch them. These men were not always trained physicians. They were often second-rate doctors, or young men willing to take the immense risk for a high salary from the city. They were municipal employees, and their job was less about curing the sick, which was nearly impossible, and more about public administration. They counted the dead, witnessed wills, and served as the public face of the state's battle against the sickness. They were both feared and respected. Grim harbingers of death, who also represented the first organized, secular attempt to manage a public health crisis. By the 17th and 18th centuries, these measures had evolved into a sophisticated, if ruthless, system of containment. The cordon sanitaire became a common tool, where entire towns or regions would be sealed off by armed troops with orders to shoot anyone who tried to cross. The last major outbreak of plague in Western Europe, in the French city of Marseille, in 1720, demonstrated the full power of the modern state's response. The plague arrived on a single merchant ship from the Levant. Despite quarantine measures, the disease escaped into the city. As it raged, the French state took action on an unprecedented scale. It erected a plague wall, the Mur de la Peste, a 2-meter-high stone wall, guarded by soldiers, to seal off Marseille and the surrounding region of Provence from the rest of France. It worked. The plague was largely contained, though it killed 100,000 people within the cordon. It was a brutal but effective demonstration of how far public health had come. The response was no longer about prayer. It was about borders, guards, and walls. The recurring nightmare of the plague had, over centuries of terror, forced humanity to develop the very tools, quarantine, public health boards, data collection, state-enforced isolation, that would form the foundation of modern epidemiology and our own ongoing battle against infectious disease. The long shadow of the Black Death had taught a terrible but vital lesson. The air itself seemed to have grown thin, stretched over a silent drum of grief. When the dying finally slowed and the survivors stepped out from their shuttered homes, blinking in the unfamiliar quiet, they saw a world remade in the image of a slaughterhouse. The psychological wound was far deeper than the demographic one. How does a society process a trauma of this magnitude? How do you explain the unexplainable? The arbitrary hand that plucked a child from its mother's arms but left the sinner next door untouched. The old answers, whispered from pulpits and illuminated in gold leaf on holy manuscripts, now rang hollow. God's plan had become an inscrutable, terrifying mystery, and so, in the absence of comforting words, people turned to images. They began to draw what they saw. They began to paint their fear. Before the great mortality, religious art was often a serene and gilded affair. Christ on the cross was a figure of noble, divine sacrifice, his suffering more symbolic than visceral. Saints gazed heavenward with beatific calm, but after the plague, a new, stark realism began to creep in. The suffering became real. The blood was redder, the thorns were sharper. Artists, many of whom had seen their own families and patrons consumed by the sickness, could no longer render the world in such idealized terms. The focus shifted from the promise of heaven to the grim reality of the grave, and from this obsession with mortality, a strange and powerful new genre was born. It was called the Danse Macabre, the dance of death. It was not a dance of celebration. It was a dance of conscription. On the walls of churches, in new printed woodcuts, and most famously in the long painted mural at the Cemetery of the Holy Innocents in Paris, the dead came for the living. The imagery was stark and democratic. A grinning skeleton, fleshless and animated, would seize the hand of a pope, his triple tiara offering no protection. Another would lead away an emperor, his crown and scepter useless trinkets. The knight in his armor, the wealthy merchant clutching his coin purse, the beautiful maiden, the scholar with his books, the farmer with his plough, and the tiny infant in its cradle, all were pulled into the same unstoppable procession. The dance was a great leveler. It was the one event to which everyone, without exception, was invited. Death, the ultimate host, did not discriminate. The message was brutal, but for a traumatized populace, it held a strange, dark comfort. In a world where all the old hierarchies had been shaken, the Danse Macabre offered a new absolute certainty. Your wealth could not buy you a reprieve. Your piety could not earn you a special exemption. Your power could not command the sickness to pass you by. This was a profound and subversive idea. The peasant, whose life had been one of deference and toil, could look upon the image of a skeleton leading away a king and see a kind of cosmic justice. It was a reminder, painted for all to see, that beneath the velvet and the rags, everyone was just a fragile collection of bones waiting for the music to stop. The theme echoed in poetry and the ubisant verses. Where are they? each station of society lamenting their impending doom. It was a public meditation on the fragility of life, a communal acknowledgement of a shared, terrifying fate. This macabre obsession manifested in other ways. The theme of the triumph of death became popular, depicting death as a skeletal horseman or a grim reaper, scything through humanity with horrifying impartiality. In the Campo Santo of Pisa, a great fresco showed a skeletal, bat-winged crone swooping down on a garden party of oblivious nobles, their fine clothes and musical instruments offering no defense against her approach. Tombs, too, began to change. The serene effigy of the sleeping noble was sometimes replaced by the transy tomb, a gruesome sculpture showing two tiers. On the top, the person was depicted in all their worldly glory as a bishop or a lord, but below, visible through an open archway, lay a second sculpture, their own decaying corpse, emaciated, skin drawn tight over bone, sometimes with worms and toads crawling from the empty sockets. The inscription would often read, "As you are, I once was. As I am, you will be." It was a memento mori, a reminder of death carved in stone. For the generation that survived the plague, life was no longer a gentle pilgrimage toward a heavenly reward. It was a frantic, desperate dance on the edge of an open grave, and the art they created was the sound of its rattling, bony music. This profound cultural shock, this tearing away of old certainties, did not simply leave a scar. It created a vacuum. With the old world so thoroughly discredited, its institutions hollowed out and its philosophies found wanting, something new had to rush in to fill the void. The Black Death did not cause the Renaissance any more than a single earthquake causes a mountain range, but it was a cataclysmic event that fractured the bedrock of medieval society, creating the fissures and fault lines along which a new world, a new way of thinking, could begin to rise. The change began not in the mind, but in the soil. For centuries, the feudal system had been a pyramid of obligation, solid and unmoving. At its broad base were the serfs, tied to the land, their lives belonging more to the manor than to themselves. Above them were layers of lords, knights and barons, all culminating in the king. But the plague shattered this pyramid from the bottom up. Suddenly, the most valuable commodity in Europe was not land, but labour. With a third, or perhaps even half of the workforce gone, the few who remained were in a position of unprecedented power. A lord with vast tracts of land was worthless if there was no one to plough the fields, sow the seeds, or harvest the grain. For the first time in generations, a peasant could simply walk away. He could leave the manor his ancestors had been bound to for centuries and seek better wages, better conditions, a better life. The lords, of course, were horrified. This was not how the world was supposed to work. In England, in 1351, they passed the Statute of Labourers, a desperate attempt to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and chain workers to their parishes. It was a spectacular failure. The law was unenforceable. The market had spoken, and the market demanded a higher price for human labour. A ploughman, who once earned 2 shillings for his labour, could now demand 3. A thatcher could double his rates. This wasn't just an economic adjustment. It was a revolution. It slowly, inexorably dissolved the bonds of serfdom in Western Europe and gave birth to a new kind of freedom, the freedom to sell one's labour to the highest bidder. This newfound wealth was not confined to the fields. In the cities, artisans and craftsmen saw their fortunes rise. Guilds, once destroyed, had to accept new members, breaking down old rigid structures. And everywhere, there was the matter of inheritance. The plague was a brutal, efficient redistributor of wealth. Entire families were wiped out, leaving their homes, their shops, their lands, and their savings to a single astonished survivor. A distant cousin, a forgotten nephew, might suddenly find himself a man of property. This sudden injection of capital, this great shuffling of assets, created new fortunes overnight. It destabilized the old noble families and empowered a rising class of merchants, bankers, and traders who were more interested in earthly profits than heavenly salvation. These were the men who would, in time, have the surplus wealth to commission great art, to fund new architectural marvels, and to patronize the scholars who were rediscovering the lost knowledge of the ancient world. The Medici family of Florence, the greatest patrons of the Italian Renaissance, built their banking empire in the dynamic, chaotic post-plague economy of the 14th and 15th centuries. The gold that funded the Florentine dome and the paint that graced the Sistine Chapel was, in a very real sense, harvested from the graveyards of 1348, the church, too. The other great pillar of the medieval world was left leaning. Its failure to stop the plague, or even to adequately explain it, was a devastating blow to its prestige. The spectacle of priests abandoning their flocks, or of the church selling indulgences at an ever-increasing rate to terrified sinners, fostered a deep and lasting cynicism. The institution's moral authority was compromised. While faith itself did not disappear, in some cases it became more fervent, more personal, more mystical. The unquestioning trust in the monolithic power of the papacy began to erode. This spiritual vacuum created space for new ideas to grow. A philosophy that had been quietly gestating among a few scholars now found fertile ground. Humanism. Humanism was not a rejection of God, but a shift in focus. It proposed that humanity, not just divinity, was a worthy subject of study and celebration. It looked back, past the scholasticism of the Middle Ages, to the glories of ancient Greece and Rome, to Cicero and Virgil, to Plato and Aristotle. It celebrated human potential, individual achievement, and the beauty of the natural world. In the wake of the plague, this message resonated powerfully. If life was so fragile, so fleeting, then perhaps it should be lived to the fullest. A carpe diem spirit, a seizing of the day, took hold. Why wait for paradise in the next life when there were pleasures, knowledge, and beauty to be found in this one? Boccaccio's Decameron, a collection of witty, secular, and often bawdy tales, was framed by the story of young nobles fleeing the plague in Florence. It is a monument to this new worldview. In the very shadow of death, they choose to celebrate life, storytelling, and human ingenuity. The plague had shown the limits of faith and the fragility of the social order. In their place, the thinkers of the Renaissance began to erect a new edifice, built on the foundation of human reason, individual genius, and a profound appreciation for the turbulent, terrifying, and beautiful world the survivors had inherited. The great mortality had cleared the ground. And now, from the ashes and the bone dust, a new kind of civilization began to bloom. The echoes of that great silence, of the half-empty continent, would reverberate for centuries, shaping not only the art and philosophy of Europe, but its very biology. The Black Death was the single greatest selective pressure event in recent human history. It was a brutal, continent-wide experiment in survival of the fittest, and we, the descendants of the survivors, still carry the results of that experiment in our blood and in our bones. For Yersinia pestis, the bacterium was not an equal opportunity killer. While it was terrifyingly effective, it was not universally fatal. A small, lucky fraction of the population possessed innate biological advantages, subtle variations in their immune systems that gave them a fighting chance. Those who survived were more likely to pass these protective genetic traits on to their children and their children's children. Over generations, the European gene pool was quietly, permanently altered. One of the most dramatic and well-studied examples of this is a genetic mutation known as CCR5 delta 32. It is a small deletion in a gene that codes for a protein on the surface of white blood cells. This protein acts as a gateway, a docking port that certain pathogens use to invade our cells. The Black Death was not the first plague, and it's likely this mutation existed at very low levels in the population for thousands of years. But against the onslaught of Yersinia pestis, it seems to have conferred a significant survival advantage. People with one copy of this mutation had a better chance of weathering the infection. Those with two copies may have been even more resistant. In the centuries of recurring plague that followed the initial pandemic, this mutation became more and more common in Europe. It is a living genetic fossil, a scar left on our DNA by the great mortality. And in a remarkable twist of biological fate, this ancient defense against plague has a modern-day benefit. The very same CCR5 protein that Yersinia pestis may have targeted is the primary doorway that the HIV virus uses to enter human cells. A significant percentage of people of European descent today carry the CCR5 delta 32 mutation, rendering them highly resistant to HIV infection. Their medieval ancestors, in their desperate fight for survival against one devastating pandemic, inadvertently bequeathed to them a shield against another, 6 centuries later. The legacy of the plague was not just biological, it was institutional. The pandemic laid bare the complete and utter failure of medieval medicine. The theories of the four humours, of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and the belief in miasmas, or bad air, were useless. The treatments, From bloodletting and purging to the application of poultices made of pigeon dung and tree resin, were not only ineffective, but often hastened death. This catastrophic failure forced a slow, painful re-evaluation. While the old theories didn't vanish overnight, the seeds of a new, more empirical approach to medicine were sown. Desperate physicians, seeking answers, began to defy religious prohibitions and perform autopsies. They needed to see with their own eyes what this disease was doing to the inside of the human body. These early, gruesome explorations were the first tentative steps toward a medicine based on observation and anatomy, rather than ancient, unquestioned texts. More importantly, the plague gave birth to the very concept of public health. Before 1347, the health of an individual was their own concern, or perhaps that of their family or their priest. The idea of the state taking responsibility for the collective health of its citizens was entirely novel, but the sheer scale of the Black Death forced civic authorities to act. In the maritime republics of Italy, which sat at the crossroads of trade and disease, the first organized responses emerged. The city-state of Ragusa on the Dalmatian coast was among the first to pioneer the practice of isolating incoming ships and their crews. In 1377, they decreed that anyone arriving from a plague-ridden area had to spend 30 days, a Trentino, in a restricted location outside the city walls before they would be allowed to enter. This period was soon extended to 40 days or quarantino, giving us the word we still use today, quarantine. Venice, the great naval power, perfected this system. They established the first formal quarantine station, or lazaretto, on an island in the Venetian lagoon in 1423. Ships were moored offshore, their cargo was fumigated with vinegar and herbs. Their crews were housed in isolation under the watchful eye of a new government body, the Board of Health. These magistrates had extraordinary powers. They could shut down markets, forbid public gatherings, arrange for the mass burial of the dead, and condemn and burn the clothing and bedding of the sick. They were the world's first public health officials, and their model was soon copied by cities across Europe. They managed sanitation, controlled the movement of people, and attempted to track the spread of the disease. It was a rudimentary system, often brutal, and based on an incomplete understanding of contagion. But it was the beginning of a monumental shift. It was the moment humanity stopped seeing sickness as a divine punishment to be endured, and started seeing it as a public enemy to be fought with the organized weapons of the state: isolation, sanitation, and information. The demographic wound took far longer to heal than the genetic or institutional landscapes took to change. It would be nearly 200 years, and in some regions more, before Europe's population clawed its way back to its pre-plague levels. This long-term demographic vacuum had profound consequences. The chronic shortage of labor continued to drive up wages and encouraged innovation. With human hands being so expensive, there was a greater incentive to develop labor-saving technologies. While the invention of the printing press by Gutenberg in the 1450s was not a direct result of the plague, it found a world uniquely receptive to its potential. The high cost of scribes made the mass production of books economically viable, in a way it might not have been a century earlier. The plague didn't just kill people, it re-engineered the economic logic of a continent, making machines more valuable and human beings more precious, and the sickness never truly left. The pandemic of 1347 to 1351 was merely the first catastrophic wave. The plague returned again and again, roughly once a generation, for the next 300 years. It became a recurring, terrifying feature of European life, a ghostly guest at every christening and every wedding. The Great Plague of London in 1665, the Italian Plague of 1629, the Great Plague of Vienna in 1679, the final major outbreak in Western Europe in Marseille in 1720, each was a devastating echo of the Great Mortality. Each new outbreak reinforced the lessons of the first, spurring further developments in public health, deepening the psychological scars, and reminding everyone of the razor-thin margin on which their civilization was built. The Black Death was not a singular event in the 14th century. It was the beginning of a new and terrible era, a long, dark age of plague that only truly ended when the brown rat, carrier of a different, more placid strain, began to dominate Europe's sewers, and when brick and stone replaced the timber-framed, thatch-roofed houses where the disease had found such a welcoming home. It receded slowly, not with a bang, but with a long, drawn-out whisper, leaving behind a world it had irrevocably and completely remade.